The palace of Velshera did not smell like power. That was the first thing Marcus Webb had learned when he took the job. Everyone on the outside, every dock worker, every cargo hauler, every wide-eyed citizen standing beneath the towering glass spires of the imperial seat, they all imagined the inside smelled like polished stone and rare perfume. It was akin to the tangible embodiment of authority. It smelled like ammonia, not the cleaning kind, the biological kind, the kind that came from 12,000 creatures packed into a structure never truly designed for that many bodies, all of them eating, breathing, sweating, and producing waste in particular ways their individual biologies demanded. Marcus had learned, in his 14 months on staff, that the more opulent a civilization became, the more aggressively it ignored its smell. That was where he came in. His official title on the Imperial Employment Register was Sanitation Engineer, Sublevel Tier 3. The Velcheron staff called him something that translated loosely to the wet worker. He had stopped asking for clarification after the first month. Some things were better left untranslated. He pushed his cart through Corridor 7 Gamma, the long maintenance artery that ran beneath the East Wing reception halls. Above his head, separated by 2 floors of marble and soundproof ceremonial chambers, the imperial court was in session. He could feel it faintly through the soles of his boots, the resonant hum of 1,000 aristocratic voices vibrating down through structural beams and ventilation columns, and finally arriving at the drainage level as something barely more than a tremor. The cart wheels squeaked. Marcus had asked Facilities 3 times for replacement wheels. Facilities had sent him a form. He had filled out the form. Facilities had sent him another form asking him to confirm the first form. He had filled that one out too, and then quietly stopped caring and learned to find the squeak rhythmically acceptable, the way you eventually stop hearing a clock ticking in a room you've lived in long enough. He was 41 years old. He had worked sanitation on 3 different space stations, 1 deep water research platform on a moon whose name he couldn't pronounce, and now here, the grandest imperial court in what the Velcheron called the recognized systems, which was their polite way of saying every piece of the galaxy they had already claimed and every piece they intended to claim soon. He was happy. That was something people misunderstood about men like Marcus. They assumed that quiet meant miserable, that a mop meant defeat. Marcus had simply come to terms with the reality that the majority of the universe relied on the labor of individuals who were not directly visible, and he had long since come to the conclusion that being invisible had its benefits. Nobody watched the wet worker. Nobody thought about what the wet worker saw. He turned his car at the junction of 7 Gamma and the auxiliary drainage access, a narrow passage that smelled considerably worse than the main corridor, which was saying something, and that was when he heard it. Not quite a sound. The drainage access ran alongside the primary waste channel, a wide concrete and alloy trough that collected the runoff from the upper palace levels and moved it toward the processing units on the far eastern side of the substructure. Marcus serviced this channel twice a week. He knew its sound the way a sailor knew a particular stretch of coastline. Every gurgle, every pressure shift, every groan the pipes made when the upper-level kitchens ran their full-cycle purges. What he heard now was none of those things. It was a low, wet, exhausted sound, almost rhythmic, almost breathing. Marcus stopped walking. He stood very still in the corridor, listening with particular quality of attention that 14 months of underground palace work had developed in him, a kind of total body listening, where you stopped thinking and simply received. There it was again. He stepped off the main path, through the narrow service door on his left, and into the access walkway beside the drainage channel. The emergency lighting down here ran on a separate grid from the palace's main power. It was older, dimmer, and cast everything in a yellowish half-light that made distances hard to judge. Marcus unclipped the work lamp from his cart belt and clicked it on. The beam swept across the channel. For a moment, his brain simply refused to process what his eyes were sending it. The thing in the drainage channel was large, very large. It was pressed against the far wall of the trough, partially submerged in the dark fluid that moved sluggishly toward the eastern processors, and the parts of it that were above the surface were wrong, in a way that only living things could be wrong. Wrong at the joints. The angles of the limbs are incorrect. The incorrectness was indicative of an injury rather than an error in anatomy. It had 4 limbs and a long, articulated torso that tapered at the rear into something. Its hide, And Marcus thought hide rather than skin because it was clearly too thick for the latter word, was a deep, shifting gray-green, the color of deep ocean water in bad weather. Along its back and shoulders, a series of elongated ridges rose like the keys of some biological instrument, and Marcus recognized these after a stunned second because he had seen them in the illustrated safety pamphlet that all new palace staff were required to read. Velcon, the pamphlet had called them, imperial hunting predators. Do not approach. Do not make eye contact. Do not make sudden movements. Please promptly report any sighting to your tier supervisor. The pamphlet had not mentioned what to do if you found one drowning. The creature's head, broad, low-set, with a jaw structure that looked capable of shearing through structural cable, was barely above the surface of the channel fluid. The ridges along its back were moving in the slow, arrhythmic way of something that had been fighting for a long time and was very nearly done fighting. One of its forelimbs was extended against the channel wall, claws scraping weakly at the smooth alloy surface, finding no purchase. It was trying to keep its head up. It had been trying for a while. Marcus stood on the walkway and looked at the dying apex predator and took a deep breath. He thought about the pamphlet. He thought about the tier's supervisor, a Velcheron named Bravasha, who wore her contempt for Marcus with the comfortable ease of someone who had never once considered that it might be uncomfortable for him. He thought about the employment form he would have to fill out to report a wildlife incident in the drainage access, and the form after that confirming the first form, and the form after that. He thought about the sound the creature was making. The creature was emitting a wet, exhausted, and almost breathing sound. He unhooked the long-handled waste scoop from his cart. Standard issue, rated for solid debris retrieval in channels up to 2 meters deep, and he knelt on the walkway and he reached in. It took him 4 tries to get the scoop positioned correctly under the creature's torso. The channel fluid was cold in a way that suggested chemical content beyond water, and by the time his third attempt scraped uselessly against the creature's flank, the wet worker's right arm was soaked to the shoulder, his knees were aching on the hard walkway surface, and he was aware, with the patient clarity of a man who had spent his working life solving problems no one else wanted to think about, that the scoop was not going to be enough. He stood up. He went back to his cart. He had on his cart the scoop, a mop, 2 compression rollers for sealant application, a length of synthetic fiber tow rope he used for hauling heavy waste containers, a chemical spray kit, a patching kit for conduit repairs, a folding step platform, and a standard-issue work lamp. He looked at these things. He took the tow rope. He took the step platform. He took the mop and used his utility blade to cut the head off it, leaving a long, smooth pole. He tied the tow rope to the pole at one end and to the drainage access's safety anchor ring on the other, and then he lowered himself off the walkway, using the rope for control, into the channel beside the creature. The fluid came up to his thighs and was cold enough to make him breathe sharply through his teeth. He positioned himself beside the creature's torso, got both arms under its midsection. It was extraordinarily heavy, the kind of heavy that reminded you that the word predator was not a metaphor, and he lifted. The creature raised its head. For 1/2 second, a single dark eye, oval, luminous, and the color of amber, lit from behind, looked directly at Marcus Webb. Then Marcus heaved upward with all his strength, and the creature's 4 legs found the edge of the walkway. With a collective effort that was neither graceful nor dignified, they got it out of the channel. It collapsed on the walkway in a heavy, shuddering mass. Marcus climbed out after it, soaked and breathing hard, and sat on the walkway floor beside the creature that the safety pamphlet said could kill him 11 different ways. He listened to it breathe. Somewhere far above, through 2 floors of marble, the imperial court hummed with its 1,000 aristocratic voices. 12 hours earlier, though Marcus had not known this yet, a different sound had filled a different space in the palace of Velshera. It was the sound of a princess making a decision. Princess Sarah Velketh, 3rd child of the imperial seat, warden of the eastern provinces, commander of the Velcheron 9th Ceremonial Fleet, and holder of 17 other titles that her personal secretary recited each morning in a ritual that had long since stopped meaning anything to anyone involved, stood in the imperial hunting grounds and looked at the creature her handlers had brought before her and felt something she did not often feel. Boredom. Yes, she felt that constantly. But beneath the boredom, today, something sharper. Disappointment. This is the specimen, she said. It was not a question. It was the way she said things that she wanted someone to know she found beneath her. The handler, a small, narrow-shouldered Velcheron named Cavet, dipped his crest in confirmation after working with the imperial hunting stock for 30 years. Yes, your luminance. Unit Designation 11. We flagged Unit Designation 11 last season for the anomalous echo sense development. The one you told me was exceptional. I used that word with certain qualifications, your luminance. The mutation in the creature's secondary sensory ridge structure allows it to process spatial information at frequencies the other Velcon cannot. Cavet. The princess turned to look at him, and the handler fell immediately silent. Does it perform? Cavet's crest lowered. The mutation appears to create a conflict with the creature's standard predatory response triggers. When presented with prey in open ground, Unit 11 exhibits a typical behavior. It does not engage with the same efficiency as the others. It hesitates, the princess said. It hesitates, your luminance. Sarah Velketh looked back at the creature. It was standing in the center of the demonstration yard, and it was looking at her. Not the way the other Velcon looked at her, with a flat, immediate assessment of a predator cataloging a non-threat, but with something that Cavet's 30 years of handling would have identified, if he were being honest with himself, and if honesty had been more convenient in the profession, as consideration. I was thinking about her. She did not notice this. She noticed it was different from her expectations. And in the imperial court of Velshera, such differences were liabilities. Dispose of it, she said, and walked away. Cavet watched her go. He looked at Unit 11. Unit 11 looked back at him. He called 2 of his staff and told them to take the creature to secondary drainage disposal, a destination from which nothing large had ever returned. And then he went back to his office and wrote, in the margin of his afternoon report where no one would see it, for words in his native script. We did not look. He was not certain, even as he wrote it, exactly what he meant. But it seemed true, and true things needed to be written somewhere, even if the somewhere was a margin. By the time Marcus Webb had gotten the creature out of the drainage channel, it had been in the disposal system for approximately 6 hours. The creature had been in the disposal system for nearly 6 hours. It had not yet reached the point of complete death. He sat on the walkway and looked at the slow rise and fall of the creature's rib cage, the ridges along its back moving in that uneven, depleted rhythm, and he thought, with the practical clarity that was the most reliable feature of his personality, okay, what do I actually have to work with here? He had the maintenance level. He had his cart. He had the knowledge, accumulated across 14 months, of exactly which palace guards checked which corridors at which intervals, because that knowledge was structurally necessary to doing his job well, and Marcus Webb had always done his job well. He had approximately 30 minutes before the 7 Gamma Patrol sweep. He put his hands on the creature's nearest limb, the foreleg with the clawed feet that had been scraping against the channel wall, and gently, with the practiced care of a man who had moved fragile and dangerous things in tight spaces for most of his working life, he began to figure out how to move it. Above his head, the imperial court hummed. The wet workers started work. The cart was not built for this. That was the first and most persistent problem. Marcus Webb's standard-issue maintenance cart was an 8-wheel flat platform model designed for waste containers, chemical drums, and the various tools of his trade, not for the transportation of a creature that weighed, by his rough estimate, somewhere between 250 and 300 kilograms, and whose body had the infuriating structural characteristic of not having a single flat surface. He solved this issue the way he solved most things, methodically, without drama, and with the materials he actually had rather than the materials he would have preferred. He used the step platform as a sled. He fed the tow rope under the creature's torso in 2 places, creating a rough harness. He used the compression rollers, bolted to the underside of the cart frame in their storage position, as makeshift wheels for the step platform, unbolting them with the multi-purpose driver from his belt kit and remounting them along the platform's base edge in a configuration that the tool's designers had certainly never imagined, and that Marcus judged would hold for approximately 50 meters before the lateral stress became an issue. It held for 63 meters. He counted. When the second roller gave out at the junction of 7 Gamma and the auxiliary branch that led to sublevel 4 storage, Marcus stopped, crouched over the failing mechanism for about 8 seconds, and used the flat of the mop pole to lever the creature's weight slightly left so that the pressure redistributed across the remaining 3 rollers. This bought him another 20 meters, enough to reach the service door storage room 4F. He had chosen 4F for 3 reasons. First, it was the deepest of the unused storage rooms on sublevel 4, tucked at the end of a branch corridor that appeared on the palace maintenance map as decommissioned seal integrity unknown. This meant no one came here on routine patrol, because the official record suggested the room might flood. Marcus knew, because he had personally inspected every room on sublevel 4 when he was new to the job and still mapping his territory, that 4F's fluid seals were actually excellent. Someone had repaired them carefully and then, for reasons Marcus had never determined, filed a false report suggesting otherwise. He had noted this in his mental map and stored it without judgment. Now it was an asset. Second, the room had an independent ventilation outlet, a narrow pipe that ran up to the structure and exited in a garden courtyard on level 2. This was important because the creature's hide was still saturated with drainage channel fluid, which had a chemical composition Marcus had once accidentally read the full analysis of, and which included several compounds that were, in enclosed spaces, gradually problematic for human respiratory systems, potentially leading to health risks such as respiratory distress or chemical exposure symptoms for anyone present in the room. Third, 4F had a functioning secondary power tap, a small junction box on the wall that Marcus had once used to run a portable lamp during an off-grid repair job. It wasn't on the palace's main monitoring system. He got the creature through the door with 7 minutes to spare before the patrol sweep. He knew it was 7 minutes because he had a countdown running in his head, not a dramatic internal monologue. Nothing like that, just a steady, practical clock that lived in the part of his brain that had learned to keep time by patrol intervals and shift changes and the rhythmic sounds of institutional life. It was the same part of his brain that knew, without looking, how much chemical compound was left in each spray bottle on his cart, and exactly how long a floor took to dry at various humidity levels. He was not a strategic mind in any grand sense. He had a systems mind. He understood how things moved through time, and he used that understanding the way other people use maps, allowing him to navigate complex situations and anticipate outcomes effectively. He closed the door 4F and locked it from the inside with the secondary bolt that wasn't on the main lock register, another detail that should not have existed but did. And he turned on the portable lamp, and he looked at what he had brought in from the dark. In the drainage channel, the creature had appeared as a shape in bad light, an emergency, and a problem to be solved. In the still air of storage room 4F, lit by the clean white beam of his work lamp, it was something else. It was extraordinary. He had seen Velcon in the palace before. Everyone on staff had. They were status objects, living demonstrations of the Empire's reach and dominance, kept in the hunting grounds, displayed at ceremonies, and occasionally walked through the upper corridors on ceremonial chains by handlers in formal dress. In that order, they were meant to be seen, feared, and admired. Marcus had looked at them the way you looked at the things that the palace wanted you to look at. Quickly, carefully, and without unnecessary engagement. He had never been this close. The creature's hide up close was not a single color but 100. The deep gray-green shifting in the lamplight to show undertones of copper and dark blue along the ridgelines, and something almost iridescent in the webbing between the digits of his forelimbs, fine membranes that Marcus had not noticed from a distance, and that seemed, as far as he could tell, to be non-functional for any obvious purpose. The ridge structure along its back, the extended sensory ridges that distinguished the specimen from others of its kind, according to the handler's explanation that Marcus had not yet heard but would not need to reach his own conclusions, was extraordinary up close. The ridges on its back were unlike the smooth, bladed ridges of the Velcon he had witnessed during the ceremony. These were jointed, each ridge made of 3 articulated segments that could, he watched in slow fascination as the creature breathed, shift their orientation independently, like the leaves of some biological satellite dish. Each one is capable of tilting toward a different signal source. He was not a zoologist. He was not a biologist. He had no formal training in xenobiology, veterinary medicine, or anything remotely related. He was, however, a man who had spent his career solving problems with whatever he had, and what he had was a first aid kit rated for Velcheron physiology, with a note in the packaging that said, "May be appropriate for warm-blooded xenobiological subjects with similar metabolic indicators. A supply closet full of materials repurposed from imperial maintenance stores. And the particular kind of steady nerve that comes not from bravery, but from having once fixed a failing coolant seal on a deep water research platform during a pressure vent, alone with a multi-tool and 20 minutes before catastrophic failure, while your heart tried to beat its way out of your chest, and you told it firmly to wait. Marcus opened the first aid kit. He started with the easiest injury first, which was the most basic principle of field triage, the deep laceration along the creature's left rear quarter, where something had torn to the hide cleanly and left a wound that was still seeping dark, thick fluid. He cleaned it with the kit's broad-spectrum antiseptic, wincing slightly at the potential species incompatibility, but the wound needed cleaning, and the antiseptic was what he had, and applied the compression bandage from the kit, not in the way the illustrated instructions showed, because the illustrated instructions assumed a Velcheron body shape, but in a way that made physical sense for a wound of this dimension and location, using an additional strip of the synthetic tow rope fiber as an anchor point. The creature's leg moved. Once, a slow, warning flex. Marcus paused. He did not pull back. He did not make a sudden movement. He stayed exactly where he was, hands still, and waited with the patience of a man who understood that stillness was a language. The leg settled. He continued. He worked for what he would later estimate as approximately 90 minutes, though his sense of time in that room was slightly distorted by the quality of concentration required. The other injuries were harder to assess. There was bruising beneath the hide that he could feel as altered density, and at least one of the minor ridge joints on the upper back appeared to be displaced rather than broken, which he addressed with a careful application of the sealant compression material from his patching kit, molded to shape and given time to set. He was halfway through this process, kneeling along the creature's back, when it regained consciousness. He knew he had regained consciousness because the ridges changed, not all at once, not dramatically, but the upper set, the three that pointed most directly backward, toward where Marcus was kneeling, shifted their orientation. Slowly, precisely. The movement was deliberate and careful, akin to a creature uncertain of its location, employing all its senses to ascertain the answer before taking any action. Marcus stopped moving. He thought about the pamphlet. Do not make eye contact. Do not make sudden movements. He thought about the fact that he was alone, in a locked room, on a sublevel of an alien palace, kneeling on the back of an apex predator with a compression bandage in his hands. He thought about the drainage channel. The claws of the predator scraped at the wall. The amber eye. You're okay, Marcus said quietly. Not loudly, not soothingly in a performed way. Just the ordinary, flat words of someone stating a fact they believe to be true. You're not in the water anymore. You're in a room. Nothing's trying to hurt you right now. He had no idea if the creature understood any of this. He had no certainty that its auditory processing had anything in common with human language reception. The ridges held their position for a long moment. Then, very slowly, they rotated away from him. Not all the way. They did not revert to the relaxed position he had observed them in during the unconscious period. They maintained a partial angle, monitoring, he thought, rather than alarmed. There was a distinct difference between a hand resting near a weapon and a hand gripping one. The creature's head turned. Slowly. The amber eye, both of them now, he realized, and they were not identical. The right one was slightly larger and angled differently, suggesting bilateral visual fields with different functions. Found him. He looked back. He did not look away. He did not look directly and challengingly either. He looked the way you looked at something you were trying to understand, without appetite or submission, just with attention. The moment lasted a long time. Then Marcus Webb held up the compression material in his left hand, showed it to the creature with the unhurried gesture of a man presenting evidence, and said, I'm going to keep going, if that's all right. The ridges did not alarm. He kept going. By the second day, Marcus had reorganized storage room 4F into something that a medical professional would have found alarming and a pragmatist would have found impressive. The central floor space, previously occupied by decommissioned atmospheric processing units that Marcus had quietly moved to form a perimeter wall that served as both structural concealment from the door's viewing slot and a set of surfaces for his improvised supply organization, was now occupied primarily by the creature. Marcus had fashioned a resting surface from the industrial insulation foam rolls stored in the room's original inventory, 3 layers deep, cut to shape with a utility blade, and covered with a sheet of the impermeable membrane fabric used for pipe sealing. It was not comfortable by any standard he could evaluate. But the creature had stopped lying on the bare floor, which suggested it found the surface acceptable. The walls along the left side held his medical and supply organization. First aid kit components sorted by likely utility, spare compression material cut into working sections, the chemical spray bottles repurposed as antiseptic applicators, and 2 of the atmospheric processing unit panels repurposed as flat work surfaces. On the right wall, Marcus had tapped the secondary power junction and run a line to the portable lamp and to a small climate control unit that he had, with considerable mechanical creativity, detached from a decommissioned storage pod and reconnected to the room's existing ventilation outlet. This last piece had taken 4 hours and required him to make 3 separate trips to maintenance supply cache in 7 Gamma during off-patrol windows, moving in the unhurried, purposeful manner of a man who belonged exactly where he was, because he was always exactly where his job required him to be, and no one looked at the wet worker twice. The climate control unit was critical. The creature's respiration had normalized by the end of the first day, but Marcus had noticed, through the patient, attentive observation that was the closest thing he had to diagnostic equipment, that its ridge movement became sluggish when the room temperature dropped below what he estimated was roughly 19 degrees Celsius. The drainage channel had been cold. Cold had been making things worse. He fixed it. He also fixed the secondary bolt on the door, which had been engaging at a 47-degree angle and creating a slight sound when thrown. He filed the bolt mechanism until the engagement was silent. This task took 12 minutes and was, in the context of everything else he was managing, a small thing. But small things that made sounds at the wrong moment were big distractions. On the morning of the second day, he sat against the wall across from the creature and ate his breakfast, a standard-issue meal pack from the staff canteen. Cold because he had no heating element. Unremarkable because the staff canteen had never in its history produced anything remarkable, and the creature watched him eat. This was new behavior. On the first day, after the moment of initial waking, it had primarily watched the door. Marcus noted the shift away he noted everything, without theatrics, with steady attention. The creature's name, the designation the imperial handlers had used, was Unit 11. Marcus found this inadequate in the way that numbers applied to living things were generally inadequate, but he also found the process of choosing a different name slightly presumptuous, since he was unsure what cultural weight names held for the species. He settled, privately, on 11. It was still a number, but when said as a name, it had a different quality, a rhythm to it. He used it when he spoke to the creature, which he did with the same conversational matter-of-factness he applied to everything else. "You've got better color in those ridges this morning," he said, on that second day, eating his cold meal pack. "The cop is back. That wasn't there yesterday." 11's head tilted, the upper ridges adjusted, that partial monitoring angle that Marcus had begun to read as interested and not alarmed, which he recognized was a significant interpretive leap, but which continued to be supported by available evidence. "I don't know what I'm going to do with you in the medium term," Marcus continued, not in a worried way, just thinking out loud in the presence of a listener. "I can keep this going for a while. I've been keeping things going on improvised solutions for a long time, but the palace isn't infinite, and neither is the supply cache. At some point, we need a better answer." He finished the meal pack. He carefully folded the packaging, adhering to a professional habit, and placed it into his work bag. "Something you should know," he said, "is that I'm not brave. I want to be clear about that. People who do what I did in that drainage channel are usually described as brave afterward, but that's a misunderstanding of how it works. Brave means you see the danger and choose anyway. I didn't choose anything. I heard you in there, and my body was already moving before I'd made any kind of decision. That's not bravery. I don't know what to call it." 11 was watching him with the full bilateral focus now, both amber eyes tracking, the ridges at their most active orientation. "I'm just saying," Marcus said, "don't put me on a pedestal. I'm a man with a mop who does not enjoy watching things drown when the drowning can be prevented." He stood, picked up his work bag, and began the morning wound check. By this point, the ritual had been established without either of them formally doing so. He would approach from the side, never directly head-on, which he concluded from observation was a position that the creature's neurology read as confrontational, and he would begin with the rear quarter laceration, which was healing cleanly and which 11 had stopped watching him treat with the guarded attention of the first day. Then the bruising assessment. He pressed lightly along the hide with 2 fingers in a consistent pattern, watching a ridge response or changes that might indicate internal developments he couldn't otherwise see. Then there was a displaced ridge joint on the upper back, which was the most complex issue and the one he was most uncertain about. On the 3rd morning check, pressing gently along the ridge joint, he felt something unexpected. The joint had receded. Not all the way. It still had a slight forward cant that he didn't think was original to the anatomy, but the displacement had resolved significantly, far faster than he would have expected from a joint injury of that severity. He sat back on his heels and looked at the joint carefully. 11 made a sound. It was the first sound the creature had made since the drainage channel, a low, resonant frequency that Marcus felt more in his chest than he heard with his ears, short and precise. Not a distress vocalization. Something more deliberate. He looked up. The creature had turned its head to look back at him, and the ridges, all of them, the full set along the back and shoulders, which he had not yet seen operating in concert, were all angled forward. Toward him, he stayed very still. The frequencies sounded again. Same pitch, same duration. Marcus thought, with a methodical quality that characterized most of his thinking. That's a repeat. Intentional repetition means communication. What is it communicating about? He put his hand carefully back against the ridge joint. The frequency changed, slightly higher. He moved his hand to an area of the back that was undamaged. The frequency dropped to the lower register. Okay, Marcus said slowly. So you feel the difference. You know where the injury is. And he paused. You're telling me it's better. The ridges shifted, not the monitoring angle. Not the alarm position. Something new, if his interpretation was accurate. And he didn't guarantee its accuracy. It appeared as though the creature was settling down, relaxing, in the small way that a body carries ease when something that needed confirming has been confirmed. Marcus sat on the floor of the storage room, in the pale white light of the repurposed lamp, with the galaxy's apex predator adjusting itself on its insulation foam and the low hum of the improvised climate unit behind him. And he thought about what it meant to understand something that had no particular reason to be understood by you. He thought about the imperial court above his head, with its 1,000 voices. He thought about the handler's word, exceptional. He thought about the thing the handler hadn't said, which was the thing Marcus had now begun to see clearly, that the mutation in 11's ridge structure wasn't a malfunction. It wasn't a conflict in the creature's predatory instincts. It was a different kind of intelligence. The other Velcon perceived the world as a hunting problem. Input, assessment, action. It was a beautiful, efficient, and closed loop. 11 felt the world as information. All of it. The temperature in the room, and the emotional state of the being across from it, and the structural integrity of the repaired joint, and the presence of movement in the corridor outside. All at once. All simultaneously. All meaningful. It wasn't broken. It was something the Imperial Court had never bothered to build a category for. Marcus was familiar with that problem. On the 5th day, 11 saved his life. Or rather, it prevented a significant professional catastrophe that would have made his life considerably more complicated and could, eventually, have been life-threatening. Marcus considered 11's actions to be sufficiently close. He was in the middle of the morning wound check when the ridges on 11's upper back snapped to full attention. Not the monitoring angle, not the interested orientation. Marcus found himself in a completely new position, with all the ridges vertical, fully extended, and perfectly still. It was akin to an antenna array reaching its peak reception. Marcus froze. He had learned, in 5 days, to read the ridge positions with the same rapid fluency. He applied the pressure gauges and conduit indicators. He did not know all the vocabulary yet, but he knew urgency when he saw it. 11's head turned, slowly and precisely, to point at the northern wall. The northern wall abutted Corridor 7 Gamma. Marcus was across the room and behind the atmospheric processing unit perimeter in 4 seconds, pulling his cart in after him. Not running, because running in corridor maintenance was a noise event, but moving in the rapid, low-profile way of a man who knew how to be quick, without being audible. He killed the portable lamp. He controlled his breathing. He heard it then. Footsteps in 7 Gamma. multiple sets. They were not following the standard patrol sweep single rhythmic pattern, but rather a different configuration. 2 people walking together. A third set slightly ahead, and the characteristic soft tap of a guidance staff on the floor that certain high-ranking palace officials use for formal corridor movement. They were not heading for 4F. They passed along the main 7 Gamma artery and continued east. Marcus waited in the dark for 3 full minutes after the sound faded. Then he waited 2 more, because 5 minutes was better than 3. Then he turned the lamp back on. 11 had not moved from the insulation surface during any of this. Its ridges had lowered gradually as the footstep sounds receded, and by the time Marcus turned the lamp on, they were back at the settled resting position. Marcus came out from behind the processing unit perimeter and looked at the creature for a moment. "Thank you," he said. The low resonant frequency resurfaced once more. Short, precise. He had begun to build a rough lexicon in his head. Imprecise and unsystematic, just a working model of a man who paid close attention. The short, low sound seemed to be an acknowledgement or a confirmation. The slightly longer version meant something more complex that he hadn't fully decoded yet. There were 2 other frequencies he had heard once each that he was still cataloging. "I'm going to need to know who that was," he said, which was not something 11 could answer in any immediately usable way, but it found it helpful to think out loud in the creature's presence, partly because it organized his thinking and partly because 11's rigid responses to his tone had begun to give him useful data about things he said, which was not nothing. He went to 4F's door and listened for another minute, with a particular quality of total body attention that the drainage level had taught him. Nothing. He cracked the door 2 centimeters and looked into the corridor. Empty. He had not seen the guidance staff, had only heard it. But there were 3 types of palace officials who used guidance staffs for formal movement, and only one of them, the imperial property oversight officials, would have any conceivable reason to be in the 7 Gamma maintenance artery. Imperial property oversight. He closed the door. He turned back to the room. He stood against the wall and thought for a while about the mathematics of the situation. Princess Sarah Velketh had ordered the disposal of her Velcon. Disposal through the secondary drainage system. Disposal, which had resulted in the creature entering the drainage channel, from which Marcus had removed it. This meant that the creature was, in the palace's official record, a disposed imperial asset. Processed through the drainage system, gone, a line struck through the imperial inventory. However, Marcus's experience had shown that the imperial inventory did not readily accept such lines without verification. This was especially true for an item of such high value. The Velcon were extraordinarily expensive to breed, train, and maintain. Someone, at some level of the palace bureaucracy, would eventually want confirmation. And someone at an even higher level, someone who had made a disposal order personally and was accustomed to orders being executed without complication, might, after 5 days, be developing the kind of irritated question that powerful people developed when things they had dismissed refused to be fully dismissed. Not suspicion. Not yet. But attention, the act of returning attention to a closed matter, akin to occasionally checking a door you were almost certain you had locked, is referred to as attention. Marcus thought about the matter for a while. Then he began reorganizing his supply cache, which was what he did when thinking, because the physical activity of organizing gave the thinking part of his mind the low-level sensory input it needed to run quietly in the background without becoming loud and unproductive. While he organized, he thought about 11. He thought about what the handler had said, a typical behavior when presented with prey in open ground, the hesitation the imperial court had read as a defect. The princess's assessment had rendered the creature useless. Marcus had thought, initially, that the hesitation might be something like caution, a more complex threat assessment process, taking longer because it was processing more information. That was still possible. But 5 days of close observation had given him a different hypothesis. He carefully considered this hypothesis, as it felt significant, and he didn't want to hastily draw a conclusion. The other Velcon looked at prey and saw an end-state problem, something to be resolved. 11 looked at prey and saw something else. It wasn't a lack of predatory instinct, not weakness. Something more like the ridge behavior he had seen in the room, the gathering and processing of everything. Not just the kill signal, but all the other signals alongside it. The temperature reading, The emotional content, the full sensory complexity of the living thing across from it is present. What if the hesitation wasn't fear or defect? What if 11 was the only Velcon who saw living things as alive, not problems? The Imperial Court had called it a failed experiment. Marcus thought it might be the most significant development in Velcon intelligence in the history of the species. He thought this quietly, carefully, without certainty, the way he thought about things he knew might matter but couldn't yet confirm. He put the spare compression material in the left section of the supply wall. He put the antiseptic applicators to the right. 11 watched him organize, and the ridges stayed calm, and in the corridor above, somewhere in the palace's vast administrative machinery, a line and an inventory record waited to be verified. Meanwhile, in the East Wing, Princess Sarah Velketh was in a meeting about something entirely different, a trade delegation from System 3 sectors out whose representatives smelled of mineral oil and spoke too slowly. And she was not thinking about Unit 11, but she had, 3 days ago, mentioned to her property secretary that she wanted the disposal confirmation filed, and the property secretary had sent the request to Sanitation Logistics, and Sanitation Logistics had sent it to Drainage Processing. And Drainage Processing had found, in their throughput records, no evidence of a large mass organic item passing through the Eastern Processor Channel in the relevant time window. This report had traveled back up the chain, growing slightly more alarming at each level, as bureaucratic anomalies always do when they approach the levels of authority that would actually care about them. It had not yet reached the princess. It would, in palace time, which moved in the slow, ceremonial rhythms of an institution that had been navigating its own complexity for several centuries. It would reach her in approximately 2 more days. Marcus did not know about the report, but he knew, in the way that systems minds know things without being told, that the closing of a matter was always more fragile than it appeared from the outside. He had 2 days, though he didn't know it was exactly 2. He thought it was probably about that. He worked with what he had. On the 7th day, Marcus brought a problem to the room instead of a solution. He sat against his usual wall with a small hand-drawn diagram on a piece of maintenance log paper, the only paper he had, and he looked at it for a while, and then he looked at 11 and he said, "I need to tell you something, and I recognize that the communication architecture between us is still fairly limited, so I'm going to say it straight and hope the tone carries some of it." 11's ridges were at the attentive but relaxed position that Marcus had come to think of as 11's version of "I'm listening." "We can't stay here much longer. I think we have maybe another 2 or 3 days before whatever's coming finds its way to someone who will actually do something about it. When that happens, this room stops being safe, and you don't have an obvious place to go, and I am a low-level sanitation worker who rescued and concealed an imperial asset, which I am fairly certain is a category of offense that ends with me in a very different kind of drainage situation." The ridges shifted, not to alarm. 2. He studied the orientation carefully. The full attention configuration he had seen on day 5, when 11 had detected the footsteps. Active processing. "So I've been working through options," Marcus continued, looking at the diagram, "and I have a possible one, but it requires getting out of the palace, which requires 2 things: a route that doesn't pass through any monitored checkpoint, and a window of time when the people who might be looking for an anomaly in the asset records are occupied with something else. I have the route. I've been building the map for 2 months for a different reason, but it applies here. The time window is harder." He paused. "The trade delegation from the Kethmir system is still in the East Wing. I've been listening to the scheduled announcements in the staff corridors. The formal reception ceremony is in 3 days. During a formal reception, the property oversight staff get reassigned to ceremonial security. The monitoring systems in the lower levels get deprioritized, while everything routes to ceremonial documentation, and patrol sweeps in 7 Gamma are reduced to a single pass every 2 hours instead of 40 minutes. He looked up from the diagram at 11. "That's the window. That's when. The question is a route, which is," he tapped the diagram, "this which I think works, but I've only ever traveled at human speed and in one direction, and you are considerably larger than me and have different mobility characteristics that I've only partially mapped." 11 moved. It was the first time in 7 days that the creature had moved toward him rather than waited. It crossed the room in 2 slow, careful steps, enormous steps, each one covering what would have been 3 of Marcus's, and lowered its head toward the diagram. Marcus held the paper flat. The ridge array extended. At various angles, the biological satellite dish was operating at full capacity. The amber eyes tracked across the paper with a precision that Marcus found slightly remarkable, since the diagram was made of human notation on maintenance log paper and was not anything that should have been legible to a non-human sensory system. But the ridges were not reading the notation. He understood that after a moment, they were reading him, reading the way he held the paper, the muscle tension in his hands, the micro movements of his fingers near the route marks, and the quality of his attention as he looked at each section of the diagram. The creature was reverse engineering his mental model of the route based on his body's relationship to paper. "You can do that," Marcus said quietly, watching the ridge array work. "That's what the atypical behavior was. You're not assessing the prey. You're reading the hunter. You're reading me." The resonant frequency again. Long version. The one he hadn't decoded yet. But he thought, watching the ridges settle, that he was beginning to understand it, not as language. He couldn't hear the full structure of it, and doubted his auditory system was equipped to do so. But as a tone, as registered, as a specific quality of sound made by a living thing that was, with whatever process it used for such things, saying, "Yes, you've understood something correctly." Marcus folded the diagram carefully and put it in his work bag. "All right," he said, 3 days. 11 returned to the insulation surface. The ridges settled to a resting position. But the eyes stayed on Marcus for a long time after, with that quality that the handler caveat had noted and not reported accurately. Not the flat assessment of a predator cataloging a non-threat, but something considerably more complex. There was a sense of recognition. On the 8th day, something Marcus had not planned for happened. He arrived at 4F for the morning session, carrying the supply replenishment from his last safe trip to maintenance cache, and he found that the wound on 11's rear quarter had healed, not progressed. Healed, closed. The hide surface was knitted together with a smoothness that left only a slight texture variation where the laceration had been. The healing process took 8 days due to the size of the injury, limited medical resources, and unfavorable conditions. He stood and looked at the wound for a moment. He thought about the ridge joint, which had receded on day 3. He thought about the bruising, which had resolved on day 5, faster than it expected, faster than the Velcheron first aid kit packaging's notes on metabolic recovery rates for warm-blooded xenobiological subjects had suggested. He thought about the drainage channel, and the 6 hours 11 had been in conditions that should, by reasonable estimate, have been fatal. "You're very hard to kill," Marcus said. The low resonant frequency. Short version. Acknowledgement. That's not a complaint. He sat down and began his morning check, habitual now, comfortable in the way that repeated careful actions become comfortable, and 11's ridge array oriented in the way he now recognized clearly as something being communicated. Pay attention. He paused. The ridges at 11's upper right, the ones that he had come to think of as the near-field orientation set, the ones that responded to immediate environmental stimuli, were angled not at the northern wall, not at the door, but at him, at his right hand. He looked at his right hand. He glanced at the back of his hand, where he had scraped it against the channel wall during the extraction 8 days ago. He had not thought much about it. It was a minor abrasion, the kind of thing you ignored. He had ignored it. It had been healing in the ordinary, slow way of minor abrasions. 11's ridges held their angle toward his hand. Marcus looked at the creature. He looked at his hand. He looked at the creature again. Are you concerned about this? The long resonant frequency. He considered this for a moment, the feeling it produced in him. Not quite surprise. Something more complicated than that. In 7 years of working maintenance on space stations, research platforms, and imperial palaces, no supervisor, colleague, or senior staff member had ever noticed the back of his hand. "It's fine," he said. "Minor. It's nearly healed." He showed it to the ridge array the way he had shown the compression material on the first day. A clear, open presentation. The ridges were oriented, processed, and held. Then something happened that Marcus could not categorize, and he would spend considerable time thinking about it afterward. 11 lowered its head. Slowly. 11's movements were precise and deliberate, and touched the back of its largest ridge. the central dorsal one, slightly different in texture from the others, which Marcus had noted without understanding the significance, to Marcus's hand. The contact lasted approximately 2 seconds. The abrasion, when Marcus looked at it afterward, seemed no different. He couldn't claim otherwise. But the specific warmth that the ridge contact had left, not temperature warmth, something else, something he could only describe as weighting away a hand on his shoulder as weight beyond its physical pressure, stayed with him through the rest of the day. He did not say anything about it. Some things happened quietly and needed to stay quiet for a while before they could be spoken about at full size. That evening, Marcus did something he had been avoiding. He looked up Unit 11 in the palace's information system for maintenance staff. He had access to the maintenance system as a functional necessity. Sub-level staff needed to cross-reference asset locations, decommission schedules, and facility specifications to do their jobs. The system security was weak because it was not designed for research by a wet worker. He found the records of the Velcon breeding program in the Imperial Biological Asset Registry. They were not deeply secured. Why would they be? The registry was administrative documentation. Who would want to steal it? He read through it in the break room of Sub-Level 3, in the 40-minute window between the evening patrol sweep and his shift change. With the same quiet attention, he brought to conduit specification sheets and chemical compound analysis reports. The Velcon program was 407 years old. The entry listed breeds, generation counts, performance metrics, training protocols, and, going back about 60 years, a series of notes on what the program documentation called secondary sensory ridge variants. The variants had appeared several times across the generations, always in isolated specimens, always assessed in the same terms: atypical behavioral modification, reduced operational utility, and recommended removal from the breeding program. Removed every time. The variance was present in every specimen over a period of 60 years. Marcus read the notes twice. Then he read the performance metrics for the standard Velcon, the ones without the variance, the ones that performed. The performance data was extraordinary, in the narrow way that performance data always was. Efficiency ratings, response times, and threat neutralization statistics. The Velcheron were meticulous record keepers when the records confirmed what they wanted to believe. There were no records of what had been lost each time the variance was removed, because you can only record what you look at. Marcus closed the system file. He sat in the break room for a moment, with the institutional hum of the sublevel around him. He thought about a word the princess had used that had come down to the handler's report in the staff gossip chain, as it always did. Because staff gossip was one of the primary information transmission systems of any large institution. She had called it a failed experiment. The experiment the Empire had been running, without knowing it, was this: whether an apex predator could develop a form of intelligence that went beyond predation. The question was whether the Ridge Array could transform into something more than just a hunting tool. 11 was the answer, and they had thrown the answer in the drainage channel. Marcus went back to work. He had a systems mind. He understood feedback loops. He understood how a system that punished variance would, over time, reduce its own capacity to adapt, leading to stagnation and vulnerability in the face of change. He understood this not as a geopolitical insight or a moral lesson, but as a simple mechanical truth, the kind of truth that presented itself when you looked at any system with patient, unbiased attention. The Velcheron Empire was vast and ancient, and it was very confident in itself. Marcus thought, walking back through 7 Gamma toward 4F for the evening check, that huge things did not fall because they were attacked. They fell because they had, for a long time, been throwing their answers into the drainage channel. He did not plan on what to do with this thought. He put away in the part of his mind where he kept things that were true and important and not yet actionable, such as unresolved feelings about his past and the implications of his current situation. He went to check on 11. The next morning, day 9, Marcus arrived to find 11 standing. 11 was not lying on the insulation surface, nor was he settled in the resting position. Standing, the full height was in the center of the room, and the ridges were oriented in a way Marcus had never seen. He stopped in the doorway. The orientation was extended, outward. All ridges displayed at maximum angle, not the narrow focus of alert or the vertical attention of emergency, but something broader, something that He applied his accumulated lexicon as best he could and felt like the equivalent of a person standing up straight and breathing in deeply. "Ready? You can feel it," Marcus said. "The windows tomorrow." The ridges adjusted slightly. Not a correction, a confirmation. He stepped into the room and closed the door. "I need to go over the route one more time," he said. "And I need you to understand something before we do." He sat down. He waited until 11's attention was fully on him, ridge array oriented and bilateral vision active. "What I'm doing, what I've been doing. I want to be clear that I don't expect anything from you for it. You don't owe me loyalty. You don't owe me protection. If we get out of the palace and you want to go a completely different direction than wherever I'm going, that is entirely your right. I'm not your handler. I'm not your owner. I'm not trying to be either of those things." He paused. "I pulled you out of the water because that was the thing to do. Everything since then has been because you're worth doing things for. That's all. No debt, no transaction." 11 was still. Then the ridges moved. The ridges didn't shift to any of the previously recorded positions. Something new. All ridges tilting forward, slightly down. Not the emergency vertical, not the monitoring angle, but a specific, precise, deliberate inclination, like a bow. Marcus thought it was something chosen freely by a living thing and not a gesture performed in response to hierarchy. He held that thought carefully, aware of how much he might be misreading, aware of how much he hoped he wasn't. "All right," he said, "let's go over the route." The formal reception for the Kethmir delegation began at the third ceremonial hour. Marcus knew the exact moment it started because the sublevel vibration changed. The 1,000 aristocratic voices of court reorganized into specific resonant pattern of ceremony, more unified, more formal, the hum becoming something closer to a chord. He had timed his movements to begin at the second hour, 1 hour travel through the route before the monitoring systems deprioritized, to be through the first 3 checkpoints before the systems shift. The final checkpoint, the one that connected the sublevel maintenance tunnels to the exterior drainage outlet that became, 400 meters further along, the edge of the palace grounds. That one he would hit in the window. He had his cart. He had his work bag. He had everything that was reasonably his to take from the staff quarters. Not much, but enough. His employment record in the palace system showed him on shift until the 5th hour. He had pre-submitted his end-of-shift reports. He had left everything in his staff locker in its proper position. He was a man going about his work. They moved through the maintenance tunnels in particular silence that had developed between them over 9 days. Not the silence of 2 beings from different species navigating unfamiliar coordination, but the working quiet of 2 individuals who had learned each other's spatial rhythms. 11 moved low and carefully, the massive body navigating the tunnel dimensions with precision that Marcus found remarkable, the ridge array in constant low-level monitoring operation, each ridge making tiny independent adjustments as the sensory information from the tunnel space fed into whatever extraordinary processing system lived behind those amber eyes. Marcus walked ahead, cartwheel silent, lamp on its lowest setting. They made the first checkpoint. The second, at the junction that led to the third checkpoint, the one Marcus had mapped as the most complex, the one that passed within 40 meters of the active staff corridors before cutting back into the deep maintenance passage. 11's ridges went vertical. Marcus stopped. He killed the lamp. He listened. Footsteps. The footsteps were distinct from the typical patrol pattern. And a voice, one voice, speaking in the clipped, precise Velcheron of the upper court. Not a staff register, not an administrative register. The voice of someone who gave orders and expected them to be received as weather, as simply a feature of the environment that others adapted to. The voice of Princess Sarah Velketh. She should not have been here. She should have been at the formal reception. Every schedule, every timing calculation Marcus had built the window around, placed her in the east wing at this hour. He pressed himself flat against the tunnel wall. He felt, rather than heard, 11's presence settle into absolute stillness beside him in the dark. The footsteps came closer. Then the service door to junction entrance opened, and the light from the upper maintenance corridor fell into the tunnel, and Princess Sarah Velketh walked in with 3 imperial guards flanking her, and her property secretary 3 steps behind. And she stopped. She was looking at a maintenance tunnel that should have been empty. It was not empty. Marcus stood in the lampless dark with his cart and his work bag, and 11 stood beside him, and the princess's eyes moved from Marcus, noting it with a flat, administrative gaze she gave to staff members, the kind of gaze that cataloged without actually seeing, and then moved past him and found 11. Her expression changed, not into anger, not yet, into something more complicated. The expression of someone whose mental model of the situation has just been required to perform a significant update and is taking a moment to process the recalculation. "You," she said to Marcus. Not to 11. To Marcus. "You're the wet worker from 7 Gamma. Yes, your luminance. That is my property. I know it was designated as such, your luminance." The princess looked at him with renewed attention. This was a level of attention she had not shown him just a moment ago, when he was merely a staff uniform in a maintenance tunnel. "I ordered it disposed of." "Yes, I found it in the drainage channel. It was alive." The silence that followed was a kind that contained several possible futures. One of the imperial guards shifted his footing. A small movement, but Marcus was very good at reading small movements, and this one meant hand moving toward holster. He did not look at the guard. He kept his eyes on the princess, as he believed her decision would determine the next 30 seconds, and she had not yet made it. "It was alive," the princess repeated, as if this was information she was still calculating the implications of. "Yes, your luminance. I kept it alive." With her gaze moved to the cart, the improvised supplies, the maintenance tools. Something moved in her expression that Marcus couldn't read immediately, and then read as incredulity. "With this," she said, "with what I had." Another silence. 11 had not moved, had not alarmed, was standing with the same absolute stillness from the dark and the ridges. Marcus could feel this without looking. Having spent 9 days learning to feel the ridge states through whatever was that a highly attuned sensory creature projected into surrounding space. We're not in emergency vertical. We're not in the predatory orientation. They were in the inclined forward position, the one 11 had used in the room, the one Marcus had thought of as a bow. The princess was looking at 11 now, and whatever she saw in the ridge position, whether she read it or simply felt in the way that creatures who are apex predators by culture rather than by biology can sometimes feel the weight of genuine apex attention. Something shifted in her expression, not softening, not quite, but a crack, a hairline fracture in the certainty. "It should have been dead," she said. "I know. Everything that goes through secondary disposal. I know." She looked at him. For the first time, she truly gazed at him, exhibiting the same level of attentiveness she usually reserved for important matters. Marcus met her gaze steadily, not definitely, not submissively. She spoke with the calm attentiveness of a man who had been watching things carefully for a very long time, and had nothing particular to hide from the watch. "Why?" she said. A single word, but he heard in it a genuine question. Not the rhetorical demand of authority, but actual confusion. She could not find any reason in her mental models for why a wet worker would do what he had done. Marcus responded, "It was because it was alive, and it didn't have to stop being alive." The princess stared at him. In that moment, the formal reception above them was reaching its ceremonial peak. The core of 1,000 voices rising to the floors and the beams and the ventilation shafts, and 11's ridges held their inclination, and Marcus held his stillness, and the guard's hand held his position near the holster, and everything that was going to happen next was balanced in the specific way that things balanced only in the moment before they tipped. Then 11 moved, not toward the guards, not toward the princess. One stepped sideways, slow and deliberate, until its position was adjacent to Marcus and slightly forward. The way Marcus thought with a part of his mind that was always watching and cataloging, that you might position yourself if you were indicating the placement of something that mattered to you, not attacking, not posturing, standing with. The princess saw this, couldn't have missed it. The Velcon she had designated as worthless, the failed experiment, the disposed asset, standing next to the wet worker, not because it had been commanded. It wasn't compelled by a chain or a handler's signal, because it had chosen. The hairline fracture in her expression grew. "Your luminance," the property secretary said, very carefully from 3 steps behind. The delegation. The princess held up one hand, not looking at him. She was looking at 11. She was looking at the ridge position and reading it, or failing to read it, or doing something in between, and Marcus could not tell which. This mutation, she said, finally, mostly to herself. The report called it a defect in the predatory response. The ridge structure allows multi-channel environmental reading, Marcus said, without making it sound like he was correcting her, because he wasn't. He was giving her information, and that was different. It's not a defect in the predatory response. It's an expansion of the sensory cognitive architecture. It processes relational information instead of just threat information. The princess looked at him again, the full attention again. How do you know this? I spent 9 days watching. Silence. Your luminance, the property secretary said again, with slightly more urgency. Princess Sarah Velketh, third child of the imperial seat, warden of the eastern provinces, commander of the 9th Ceremonial Fleet, holder of 17 titles, stood in a maintenance tunnel and looked at a janitor and an apex predator and the improvised cart between them, and she made a decision. The asset was disposed of, she said. The disposal record was filed. What I am seeing in this tunnel is a maintenance worker on routine service. She did not look at her secretary. She did not look at the guards. That is the official position. She turned and walked back through the service door. The guards followed without looking at Marcus. The property secretary paused in the doorway for exactly 1 second, looking at Marcus with an expression that contained several things he did not have time to catalog, and then followed. The door closed. Marcus stood in the dark of the tunnel and let out a breath that he had been holding for what felt like a geologically significant period of time. Beside him, 11's ridges moved to the settled resting position, the low resonant frequency. Long version. Marcus thought he finally understood what it meant. I know. They moved through the remaining 2 checkpoints in 23 minutes. Marcus did not rush. Rushing was a noise, a visible disturbance in the pattern of ordinary maintenance work, and ordinary maintenance work was the only identity that had gotten him this far. He pushed his cart at his usual pace, lamp at working level, and 11 moved in a low, patient way they had developed together over 9 days, and the monitoring systems in their deprioritized state noted a single maintenance worker and logged nothing unusual, because the sensor calibration for this corridor was designed for Velcheron physiology, and 11, moving at suboptimal reflectivity against the alloy tunnel wall, fell below the standard alert threshold. Marcus had noticed the phenomenon during his original route mapping. He had not noted it for this purpose. He had simply noted it, the way he noted everything, and filed away in a place where accurate observations about the world lived until they were needed. At the final checkpoint, the junction between the maintenance tunnel and the exterior drainage outlet, he stopped. He removed his staff identification badge from its clip and placed it carefully on top of the cart. He removed his palace issue work vest and folded it over the cart handle. He took from his work bag a civilian coat, his own, kept in the staff locker under his uniform, and put it on. He looked at the cart for a moment. 14 months. The squeaking wheels. The 3 request forms for replacement wheels were present. The organizational layout on the lower shelf had been the same for so long he could describe it with his eyes closed. He left it there. He took the work bag. He looked at 11. This is the final opportunity to change course, he said. The ridge array was oriented fully toward him, both amber eyes. The inclined forward position. All right, Marcus said. The exterior drainage outlet opened to a narrow concrete channel that ran along the base of the palace's outer wall, eventually joining the broader water management system that fed the lower city. It was dark. It smelled like what was used for, and it was not a dignified exit. Marcus found this appropriate. They moved through the outlet and out from under the palace wall, and the sky above the channel was the deep blue-gray of a Velshera pre-dawn. The 2 stars still below the horizon, the city lights above making their particular reflection in the water, and for the first time in 9 days, there was no ceiling above his head. 11 stopped at the channel opening and held still. Marcus watched the ridge array extend to its full configuration and hold there, processing the unmediated external environment for the first time since before the drainage channel, before the imperial grounds, possibly for the first time in a considerable part of his life. He did not hurry it. He stood in the pre-dawn at the edge of the city and waited, and the city made its various sounds, and the ridges worked through their independent orientations. And after a while, 11 looked at him with both amber eyes and made the short, low frequency. Ready? Marcus looked out at the lower city. The docks, the cargo routes. These were the places where men, avoiding eye contact in the corridors, lived, worked, and navigated the intricate machinery of galactic commerce in an imperceptible yet necessary manner. He knew how to live in those places. He thought 11 could learn. There's a cargo district 2 kilometers south, he said. I know someone who moves freight between the outer system stations. She has asked me, twice, if I wanted to stop cleaning floors and come work for her. I said no both times because I didn't have a good reason to change things. He paused. I have a reason now. He picked up his work bag. It's a different kind of work, he said. I don't know exactly what we'll be doing. I don't know what that looks like for you. Given your abilities, we'll figure it out. We figure things out as they come up. 11's ridges settled. The inclined forward position was held briefly and then moved to something Marcus had not seen before, a more complex configuration. Several ridges at different angles simultaneously, like a chord rather than a single note. He thought about this all the way through the lower city. He thought he understood it, or was beginning to. Part 9, What is Forged? 3 months later. The freighter Kisari Light ran a circuit between 4 outer system stations and the Velcheron trade hub, carrying the kind of cargo that did not require inspection if the manifest paperwork was correct and the crew was unremarkable. The crew of 3 had recently expanded to 5, which the ship's owner, a compact, sharp-eyed woman named Dora Nas, who had been running outer system freight for 11 years and who asked useful questions and did not ask useless ones, had accepted with a brief, complete assessment of someone deciding that a development was either a problem or an asset. She had decided on an asset. Marcus Webb ran cargo logistics and mechanical maintenance. He was excellent at both. He had always been good at the practical management of systems, and a freighter was a system like any other, a contained, interdependent set of functions that required attention and adaptation, and the willingness to solve problems with available materials rather than waiting for ideal conditions. The 5th crew member had no ship's registry designation. Dora had noted, in the dry, pragmatic way she noted everything, that official registries were for beings that official registries had categories for, and that she would handle the paperwork situation as she handled all paperwork situations. Creatively, what the 5th crew member did in practical terms was this. In close quarters, 11's ridge array processed the full environmental complexity of any space it occupied. Every vibration in the hull plating, every atmospheric irregularity, every biological signal from every crew member and passenger, and every variation in the ship's mechanical systems. This was not something Marcus had strategized or predicted. It was simply what happened when you put a multi-channel sensory cognitive system into an information-rich environment and gave it time. Dora had noticed, on the 3rd voyage, that when 11's ridges went to focus attention position, something was about to need fixing. She had tested the idea systematically over 2 more voyages, cross-referencing ridge state changes with subsequent mechanical or environmental events. She had presented her findings to Marcus over a meal in the common room, one evening with the tone of someone reporting a confirmed hypothesis. It's a better early warning system than anything in the ship's hardware, she said. She stated that it outperforms the ship's hardware by approximately a factor of 4. Yes, Marcus said. You knew this. I suspected it. There wasn't a reliable way to confirm it until we had the data. Dora had looked at him for a moment and then looked at 11, who was occupying a floor space near the secondary access hatch that I had adopted as a preferred position because it gave simultaneous ridge access to the engine room vibration channel and the cockpit atmospheric readouts, and then looked back at Marcus. There was a handler, she said, Imperial Biological Assets. He filed a report 3 months ago. Minor inquiry. Asset disposal confirmation anomaly. It was closed. Marcus ate his meal. I know. He wrote something in the report margin that wasn't standard language. Marcus set down his fork. What did it say? Dora's expression was precise and unreadable, like someone who has thought carefully before delivering information. Something was not seen clearly, she said. Official translation. His secretary filed notation that the margin comment was a clerical error. It wasn't a clerical error, Marcus said. No. They sat with this for a moment. 11's ridges made a small adjustment, one of the independent micro-movements. A single ridge tilting toward the engine room hatch. A minor reading, nothing requiring action. A constant quiet monitoring of the world around it. The ongoing work of sensory mind for whom the environment was never just background. Marcus had thought about the palace handler, Cavet, more than once in the 3 months since. Marcus had pondered over the significance of the 4 words in the margin. Marcus had pondered over the 60 years of records in the asset registry and the repeated decisions to eliminate the variance. He had considered the systemic cost of being so sure of what you wanted that you couldn't see what you found. He did not consider himself to be a moral figure in this. He did not believe that his choice in the drainage channel was a principled stand, a rebellion, or any of the larger narratives that stories were made into. He thought of it as what it was, a man who heard a sound and reached in. What happened next was just what happens when you let a living thing out of the dark. He still had a systems mind. He still thought about things in terms of inputs and feedback loops, in a way that small, accurate decisions accumulated over time into outcomes that looked, from the outside, like they had been planned. They had not been planned. They had been attended to. There was a difference. On the 4th voyage out, they encountered a navigational situation, a debris field from a collision event in the shipping lane, uncharted, appearing on the ship's sensors too late for standard evasive protocol. Dora was at the controls. Marcus was in the cargo hold. The ship's computer was processing and had 8 seconds to decide. 11's ridges went vertical. Marcus was through the common room and into the cockpit in the time it took the ridges to complete the alarm position, because he knew what that position meant, and his body had learned to respond to it the way it responded to his own senses, without the delay of decision, with the direct motion of a response already integrated. He said, "Hard port, 15 degrees, drop 200 on attitude." Dora did it. She had 3 seconds on the clock. She asked no questions because she had the data from 5 voyages, and the data said, when Marcus gives a navigation input and it comes from 11, take it. The debris field passed 60 meters off the starboard side. In the silence afterward, with the ship's computer still processing the event and preparing its damage assessment report, Dora sat at the controls and let out a long breath. "Good," she said, not theatrically, just a word, in the tone of someone acknowledging that a system had worked. 11's ridges moved to the resting position. Marcus stood in the cockpit doorway. He thought about a drainage channel and a wet, exhausted sound in the cold floor of maintenance tunnel and 9 days of improvised medical care in a repurposed storage room, and a princess who had, for one strange, fracture-showing moment, looked at something she'd thrown away and seen it had not stayed thrown. He thought about what you built when you decided that what was alive in front of you should stay that way. He thought about loyalty and what it was made of, not command, not a chain. These are not the ceremonial bindings of an imperial court, which are built on hierarchies of declared value. Something quieter, something built from the inside out, over time, through the patient accumulation of days when you showed up and did the thing that needed doing and did not ask for an accounting. He looked at 11. 11's ridges were in the core configuration now, the complex one, the one he had first seen at the drainage outlet in the pre-dawn of the lower city, the one he'd been understanding in increments across 3 months. He understood it now. It was not a single meaning. Some communications were too large for single notes. It meant, I see you seeing me. I see what you did, how much it cost, and what you never asked for. I am here and I choose this, and no chain made me. It meant we. Marcus Webb leaned against the cockpit doorway of the Kasuri light and looked out to the forward viewport at the debris field receding in their wake, and the open trade lanes beyond it and the vast, unregistered space of everything that the Empire called the recognized systems, all the claimed pieces and yet-to-be-claimed pieces, and felt, with a quiet and steady completeness, that he was exactly where his life had been going all along, not planned, attended to. Outside, the stars held their positions. Inside, the ridges made small, constant adjustments as they read the world. The Kasuri light flew on.